So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Tonya Callaghan. Dr. Callaghan is an associate professor with the University of Calgary's Werklund School of Education. They taught secondary English for over 10 years in Canadian and international schools in both rural and urban settings, and in the Catholic and non-Catholic systems. Their second monograph, Homophobia in the Hallways, Heterosexism and Transphobia in Canadian Catholic Schools, was published in 2018 with the University of Toronto Press. Dr. Callaghan was recognized for their outstanding commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion at the University of Calgary with the 2020 EDI Award. Dr. Callaghan was also honored with 2 University of Calgary Curriculum Development Awards for designing and coordinating an undergraduate course titled Diversity in Learning and a Master of Education program titled Advancing Healthy and Socially Just Schools and Communities, both of which actively promote equity, diversity, and inclusion principles. Their research in the field of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, explores Catholic resistance to homophobia, transphobia education in both curriculum and educational policy. A warm welcome to you, Dr. Tonya Callaghan.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kassan. I really appreciate that. Thank you for everyone who is here on your lunch hour. So I know time is a premium right now, so I'm just going to share my screen. Hope everybody can see that. Yep, so that looks good. And thank you so much to Dr. Johnson for doing the land acknowledgement. So I do have a little slide here acknowledging the land. It's very important to do. I just want to give an overview of today's talk. So in her 2016 TED Talk titled The Urgency of Intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, the African-American law professor who coined the term intersectionality, observed, quote, "We all know that when there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it." The problem Crenshaw is talking about here is multiple forms of discrimination based on layers of difference. I will define what it means to take an intersectional approach when supporting the learning needs of students enrolled in contentious courses that actively address equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, issues. The Werklund School of Education's undergraduate course, Diversity in Learning, has been held up as an EDI exemplar. And I will be drawing from my experience leading this course to talk about ways that we can all move towards inclusive and equitable teaching practices. I will conclude by overtly addressing the toll such work can take on those of us who actively teach EDI topics and what allies can do to support us. So the University of Calgary's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion defines equity as, quote, "a principle, condition, process, and outcome rooted in human rights and the inviolability of human dignity. It is integral to the legal principle of justice and the ethical principle and practice of fairness," end quote. Inequity, then, is an unfair situation that disregards human rights and dignity. We're all connected to the academy in some way or another, so I'm sure that you can probably imagine some examples of systemic inequities in higher learning. I'm sure that some of them are coming up in your mind right now. So let's take a moment here, if you will, to brainstorm together some of these. Let's just feel free to talk with one another here about some of these inequities that you know exist, that you've seen. And it would be wonderful to hear your voice, if possible, if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself and even sharing your screen, sharing your video as well, if you're willing to do that. So just think of some systemic examples of inequity that relate to or affect the entire post-secondary system, including its most basic operations. What are some of those that you know about? Just doing a check here about what we already know. Anyone willing to share anything?
So in the chat, it says assessment of BIPOC learners. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, so can we elaborate a little bit about how that's an example of inequity?
So just that they seem to get harsher.
Oh, I see.
This is for the same, era or inexperience in their learning, get penalized more than others.
Okay, that's a very good example. Thank you. Are there any other examples? Oh, thank you for raising your hand over there. Anne, do you feel like I'm using your mic
Yes.
for us? Thank you.
So one of the things that I think about quite often is tuition fees and who is actually able to attend and who is not, and especially considering graduate stipends, who can actually afford to go on to higher education.
Excellent point. Yeah, classism in the academy is something I'm about to talk about shortly. So yes, that's a really great example. Any others? Maybe we'll take a couple.
In the chat, Deborah Marshall says the selection of speakers for learning sessions.
Okay, yes. Yeah, oftentimes, I guess she's suggesting that there are often people with a lot of privilege, white people, for example, and I'm guessing that's what she's getting at. Mm-hmm.
And then Fabiola Appreciating has said admission requirements that skew to the privileged. Kristen Flemons is saying unpaid internships as expectations.
Oh, these are great examples. Yes. I've been asked to promote unpaid internships. People send me an email, saying, "Oh, send this around to your people." I say, "Well, I just can't do that if it's unpaid." So I just refuse. Je refuse. Anyway, so yes, thank you for all that input. I appreciate that. And if you think of others, just feel free to add them into the chat. But yeah, so when we were talking about, I was alluding to classism there. So one obvious example that comes to mind for me is the Academy's over-reliance on the precariat class. You might have heard of this term, a scholar who must exist without employment predictability or security to support tenured faculty members and without whom the entire system would collapse. In 2018, the Canadian Association of University Teachers issued a report about contract academic staff that says, quote, "For a substantial number of survey respondents, part-time teaching is precarious work, characterized by income insecurity, exclusion from career development, and unrecognized and unremunerated contributions," end quote. The COUT report also says, quote, "The promotion of university, college, and polytechnic teaching staff in these types of non-permanent teaching positions is increasing relative to those in permanent, usually tenure-track positions. This phenomenon is difficult to study because the institutional data to do so is hard to obtain, curiously guarded, and changes each year. Because of this, contract academic staff are often referred to in the literature, the research literature, as quote unquote hidden academics in the post-secondary labor force. Not only are their numbers unknown, their experiences are also in the shadows, end quote. This is a classic proletariat versus bourgeoisie scenario that we see playing out in front of us every day, in which a growing class, if you will, of instructor has been created in order to serve the academy, but whose work is systemically undervalued and unrewarded. And of course, here's the glaring example of racism in higher learning. And that's how a person's race or ethnicity differentially affects their experiences and outcomes in the post-secondary education system. Institutional racism is supported by a system of white supremacy. And I'm sure lots of images come to mind here as I mention that word. I know it does whenever I teach about it. But I'm not referring here to extreme hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and other local groups that go by names like Aryan Guard and Soldiers of Odin. Instead, I'm referring to the everyday pervasiveness, magnitude, and normalcy of white privilege, dominance, and assumed superiority. So, as we alluded to by one of the comments in the chat, we see a lot of white people in positions of structural power in post-secondary institutions. We are trying to change that, though, as you may see. Another big problem in post-secondary is institutional sexism. Similarly, institutional sexism operates strongly in higher learning, supported by the overarching ideology of patriarchy, which is the belief in the inherent superiority of men and male norms. The structure of higher education has provided restricted employment, career, and leadership opportunities for women who continue to be underrepresented in senior leadership positions across a range of disciplines, earning considerably less than their male counterparts. Research examining the careers of women in academia has long found persistent family-work conflict, and this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. Recent studies have deftly captured how increased home demands on academic mothers due to the pandemic, such as caring for young children, being responsible for remote schooling, and so on, has interfered with their perceived capacity to meet ideal academic norms. In academia, gender and the presence of young children at home were the most significant predictors of research disruptions. We must not overlook the life outside the academy, and we must be careful not to conflate equity with equality. Equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. And equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the appropriate resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So you can take a look at this image here before you, and I'm sure many might have come across this one, but it's basically depicting a game that people would like to see, a soccer match, but they are hindered by a wooden fence. And in the first image on the left, equality, it says the assumption is that everyone benefits from the same supports, and this is equal treatment. You'll notice that all the people in front of the in front of the fence there are all placed on the same size of box. Then in the next one, the middle one there, it says equity. Everyone gets the supports that they need. And this is the concept of affirmative action, which many of you are aware of, thus producing equity. So you can see that the child or the smaller person there is given 2 boxes. The woman is given 1, the man is not given 1 because he can see over the fence. And that's considered equity or affirmative action to give people like a bit of a leg up there. And then on the right, we've got this concept of justice here, where the actual fence has been removed and replaced with a chain link fence so that everyone can see through. So all 3 can see the game without supports or accommodations because the causes of the inequity was addressed and this systemic barrier has been removed. So I think it's always important to, make sure we understand the terms that we're talking about. And then intersectionality, what is that, right? As we've discussed, there are many examples of inequities in higher learning. Some of you come up with some great suggestions there. These 3 that I've talked about class, race, and gender, that I've singled out here cannot be fully understood until we consider them in relation to one another, which brings us to the concept of intersectionality. And since we're all involved in the academy in some way or another, you've all likely come across this term. And you may have even been invited to examine your various privileges in some kind of workshop or maybe in a course. So let's take a moment here to check our collective understanding of intersectionality. Again, you can feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself so we can hear what your understanding is of intersectionality. Don't be shy, just let me know what you think it is. Maybe some of those images on the slide can give you a sense.
I can jump in. And also Dr. David Keegan says, when someone is a member of multiple non-dominant oppressed groups.
Well said, nicely and succinct. I like that, very good. And what were you going to say too?
And I was going to say that in epidemiology, we actually have to stratify by potential variables that may be confounding or affect modifiers. And so thinking about these other variables to actually get to what is causing the inequity.
Okay, also very well said. Thank you. Thanks for that input. It's always nice to hear from everybody that's here today too.
There's one more.
Oh yeah, of course.
The way the different aspects of your identity relate and cause compounding, compounding oppression or privilege. Mm-hmm. And then advantages in some spheres and disadvantages in others because of one's identity's membership to different communities.
See, I knew everyone here knew a lot about intersectionality already, right? So it's good to tap everybody and see what they know. So here's a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw there, commenting on the federal government of Canada's speech from the throne in 2020. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney called intersectionality a, quote, kooky academic theory, end quote. Some conservative politicians and right-wing media have critiqued intersectionality as everything from, quote, as conspiracy theory of victimization, end quote, to creating a, quote, new caste system, end quote. However, in a May 2019 interview with Vox, Kimberly Crenshaw, pictured here, the legal scholar who coined the term in 1989, said intersectionality is not about creating a hierarchy with the most oppressed people at the top. Rather, she said, the point of intersectionality is to make room for more advocacy and remedial practices to create a more egalitarian system. So that's what we're trying to do with intersectionality. Okay, so there's some people who still need to be reminded of that. So why is intersectionality so urgent for addressing systemic inequities in higher learning? Anne Sisson-Runyon, a professor of political science and former head of women's, gender, and sexuality studies, observed that in our current political and cultural moment, deeper intersectional insights and actions are needed now more than ever. She wrote, quote, "As a structural and relational theory and a method of analytic tool, intersectionality is poised to reveal both the intersections of institutions, systems, and categorizations that produce oppression and the intersection of identity categorizations within individuals and groups. Ideally, intersectionality can disable hierarchical exclusions and enable peoples subjugated in different but connecting ways to coalesce around a more expansive agendas for social and ecological justice. Understanding intersectionality as the ways we or others simultaneously occupy both oppressed and privileged positions is essential to combating the interwoven prejudices people face in their daily lives." Let us turn now our attention to what it might mean to take an intersectional approach when supporting the learning needs of students enrolled in contentious courses that actively address equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. The Werklund School of Education's undergraduate course, Diversity and Learning, has been held up as an EDI exemplar because it underscores how inclusive teaching involves creating equitable and welcoming educational environments that prepare pre-service teachers for the diversity of the 21st century classroom. I will now draw from my experience leading this course to talk about ways we can all move towards inclusive and equitable teaching practices. Diversity in learning explores EDI issues in education from a critical social justice perspective. A critical approach to social justice refers to specific theoretical perspectives that regard most societies as stratified, and by that I mean divided and unequal, in significant and influential ways related to social groupings such as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, and ability, among others. Course readings are informed by critical social theories that explore power and privilege in educational contexts with a view towards thinking critically about the social context in which people teach and learn. The main assignment for this course is called Action for Social Justice and involves turning abstractions into a direct and concrete encounter by participating in a diversity experience outside of class. Some of the course objectives include consciousness raising, examining the meanings and implications of action and inaction, and appreciating difference. It is considered important to connect with others who have different beliefs and/or identities and engage in educational dialogue with individuals of different identities, beliefs, and/or cultural traditions. Students are asked to locate and attend an event that they identify as an area for potential personal growth in order to envision actions that they might take for social justice. Students are asked to attend an event that will allow them to critically examine taken for granted norms. They are asked to attend this activity alone. Projects can take many forms and primarily involve participation at pre-approved events. The potential for profound learning and understanding is reliant on students' ability to interrogate their own identity and areas or communities or concepts about which they would like to develop a more open mind. The Action for Social Justice assignment is especially illuminating for students from the dominant culture who hold a lot of privilege. I'm just about to share with you two examples of the most impactful topics that students from the dominant culture have explored: the World HIJAB Day and LGBTQ literacy. The World HIJAB Day recognizes millions of Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab and live a life of modesty. It is a way to foster religious tolerance and understanding by inviting women, so non-hijabi Muslims or non-Muslims, to experience the hijab for one day. The education students who have taken part in the World HIJAB Day have found it to be a memorable, visceral experience that opened new pathways to understanding for them, which eventually counteracted some of their prior beliefs and controversies surrounding why Muslim women choose to wear the hijab. And to try to better understand gender and sexual diversity, this one has been a very popular choice among some of the male education students that I've taught over the years. Some choose to volunteer for Camp Firefly, that's pictured on the right there. That's not the biggest picture, but that's their little logo. A local leadership camp for LGBTQ youth. Others volunteer to assist with the school's Gay Straight Alliance, and I can explain what that is later if you like. And some attended a drag show, which many of you know what that is, to gain better understanding of just one aspect of the LGBTQ communities and shed a few of their long-held homophobic beliefs. So those have been the most impactful learning experiences that I've seen from those in the dominant culture. Some Black, Indigenous, and people of color, referred to as BIPOC students, and those who are otherwise considered diverse because of their disabilities or sexual orientations, did not immediately see the potential of this assignment for them. But once we talked about how members of marginalized groups do not necessarily have the lock, so to speak, on diversity and could still learn a lot by exploring other marginalized groups, they got excited about this assignment and created some fantastic action for social justice projects around topics like class, as we discussed earlier, and religious diversity. For example, some students volunteered to serve lunch at the Calgary Drop-In and Rehab Center or the Calgary Mustard Seed to examine classism, racism, and poverty, while others attended an interactive session called Diverse Abilities as a part of UCALGARY's EDI week to explore their relationship to ableism. And others chose to visit a Sikh Gurdwara called the Dashmesh Culture Center to learn more about religious diversity, anti-racism pedagogy, and multiculturalism and their implications for teaching. Taking an intersectional approach to an assignment like this means building flexibility into the description of it that allows students to propose an alternative assignment that still achieves the same objectives. For some BIPOC students, it can be difficult for them to witness their white classmates learn about different forms of oppression that they experience daily. And it can be uncomfortable bringing to the fore some topics that they may feel are best kept tamped down. For other BIPOC students, it can be actually quite liberating to see their white classmates finally learn about their privilege and talk openly about classism, racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression. I know that diversity in learning is not an easy class to take, and it's certainly not an easy class to teach. I've been teaching this course since I was first asked to design it, early iterations of it back in 2012. And I still make sure to wear a t-shirt under my long sleeve blouse or shirt, because I know I'm going to sweat, of course, when talking about oppression and power and the structure of racism and white supremacy, also about homophobia, transphobia, heterosexism. And as the coordinator of this course, I organize meetings and workshops about teaching difficult topics for the members of the teaching team that teach the 12 or so different sections of this course. I fielded emails from instructors struggling with resistant students. As you all know, we live in Southern Alberta, and there are some people who are maybe not so on board with the social justice project. So we can sometimes come across resistant students. And I know that some BIPOC instructors gave up on teaching the course because it can take a personal toll. I also know, however, that conversely, some BIPOC scholars regularly look forward to teaching this course because it can be a form of vindication, a vehicle for resistance and liberation from oppressive structures. Constantly teaching against the grain can have negative repercussions on an academic's mental health and well-being. And so we should do well to remember Black lesbian feminist poet and civil rights activist Audre Lorde's view about self-care, quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare," end quote. So if you're a BIPOC teacher scholar, find ways to prioritize preserving yourself because your presence is needed here. This is also true if you're a scholar with a disability, a member of LGBTQ communities, non-Christian, or the first in your family to become an academic. I had to engage in some serious self-care myself recently due to some anxiety I was experiencing after receiving a death threat upon the publication of my most recent scholarly book about homophobia and transphobia in Catholic schools. If I'm not well, I cannot be much help to others. I cannot be the activist academic that I was hired to be. It took a lot of courage, but I am happy to say that I did reach out for help and I got the care that I needed when I needed it. So I encourage others to do the same. So how can you incorporate intersectionality into your work here at UCALGARY? No matter what your role is at the University of Calgary, you can always work to be a more intersectional ally. And here are just a few ideas. Many of you may have heard of this before. Check your privilege. Look just beyond your skin color. Middle class, university level education, able-bodied, cisgender. All your social identities play into your privilege, even if you didn't ask for it. Reflect on these and consider how this impacts the discriminations you do and don't experience. Listen and learn. At its very core, intersectionality is about learning and understanding views of others. Listen to, include, and meaningfully collaborate with diverse groups of people. Hear and honor their words. But remember, it's not the responsibility of marginalized groups to do all the work of educating others. This often takes up lots of emotional labor and should never be taken for granted. So do be prepared to help undertake some of this labor by doing your own research. Educate yourself about groups that you have been separated from. Build authentic cross-group relationships. Make space. Ask yourself if you're the right person to take up space and speak on certain issues. Center stories and actions on those with the lived experience. Don't speak for others and don't speak over others. Have humility and admit to not knowing. Invite other voices in. Watch your language. So many of the words we use every day are ableist, exclusionary, and offensive to marginalized communities. When was the last time you heard "that's so lame" or "that's crazy" when you were annoyed about something? Consider how someone with a physical impairment or a diagnosed mental illness might hear this. Recognize and correct your use of such terms. Take responsibility for mistakes. By avoiding language that assumes our own experiences are baseline, we can open ourselves up to listening to other points of view. I opened this talk by referring to UCALGARY's webpage for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I would like to leave you with some ideas from the other sociologist, Dr. Zuleika Zavalos, a Peruvian-Australian applied sociologist living on Gadigal land, also known as Sydney, Australia, to start reviewing your own organization's equity, diversity, and inclusion strategic plan. Publicize and review policies and practices. Note, policies that meet legal requirements are the bare minimum and have not worked to change the gender landscape. Publicly commit to critical and ongoing evaluation and revision of policies and practices. Publish a clear summary of policies on the organization's external-facing website. Make available detailed policies in plain language, not in legalese or HR speak. I'm sure many of you know what that looks like. Adopt gender-inclusive language as standard practice. Review policies using phrases such as all genders rather than men and women. Embrace gender-inclusive pronouns such as they rather than he or she. Consider going beyond pronouns to include mental and physical health issues. Analyze equity, diversity, and inclusion and publish the results. Collecting numbers about men and women does little to shift the dial on racism, ableism, ageism, classism, homophobia, and transphobia in organizations. Use an intersectionality framework to evaluate how faculty, staff, students understand and experience gender equity issues. Create a transparent plan for change that can be easily accessed by all. Use intersectionality to overhaul decision-making, resource allocation, improvement of services, and representation. Foster a climate that welcomes and values the safety of minorities, especially those from equity deserving groups, over and above the comfort of white people. Provide funding for cross-disciplinary groups, especially women of color, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit groups, to widen their networks of support. Respond rapidly and unequivocally to remove racial injustice, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and other forms of exclusion. Prominently showcase equity deserving groups across the organization at all levels, including the physical environment. Update portraits and artworks on walls, names of buildings and rooms. Provide gender neutral washrooms, include preferred pronouns. Develop explicit guidelines and set processes for funding that consciously take into consideration biases in the publication system. Consider who gets to make the rules of the academy. Tenured scholars, who are mostly white and male, largely make the rules that determine who else can join the tenured ranks. This involves what sociologists call boundary work, or the practice of a group setting rules to determine who is good enough to join. Practice seeing these habits and devise ways to change them. Okay, so that's all I'm going to be sharing with you for today. So we can open it now to some comments or thoughts from the floor, from people who are here today. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Dr. Callaghan. We already have a couple of comments.
Okay.
So Dr. David Keegan says, I can't help but notice how few men are participating in this session. This is a huge problem. Thank you to the men who have showed up. We as men need to recruit more men to these kind of sessions.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And men can also identify as feminists, so if you feel that you have a feminist worldview, let people know that, if you're male, and tell your male colleagues that you're attending such a session, invite them to come.
And Kristen Flemons asks, how difficult was it for students to name and acknowledge their biases? I think she's referring to the course. And how much work was it to get to the point where students were able to state their biases in order to choose an activity or field site?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. It's very challenging. We have to do some journaling. We talk together, we work in groups. I ask them questions like, okay, were you ever called out, let's say, by a family member or someone saying that you make a lot of homophobic jokes, for example? If you're somebody who does that, or someone has brought that to your attention, then that's obviously an area for you to explore, even as it may be an area that you really want to stay away from because it's something that bothers you or you feel uncomfortable about gender and sexual diversity, then that's obviously something for you to explore. And it really takes a lot of inner courage and self-knowledge for them to do a good assignment. Other things I do is I ask them to, do exercises to examine their points of privilege, where they have privilege and where they do not have privilege. And if they have privilege in areas of wealth and they don't know what it might be like to experience poverty, then I suggest to them that, it might be good to go and volunteer at a soup kitchen, I give them some of the ideas that are already very effective. And then I ask them to do some internet searches and also, but really get really inward. And it's almost like a therapy session, for them to, I ask them, how do you feel? What makes you nervous? When do you sweat or worry about certain groups of people? And if you're going to become a teacher, you're going to be working with the whole gamut of the population. So you have to be willing and ready to and able to work with all kinds of people. So if there's something that makes you nervous, like for some women, they have preconceived notions or misunderstandings about the hijab. The hijab has been the World Hijab Day is an excellent opportunity for them to explore that and learn, okay, why might some women choose to wear the hijab? And then what happens to them when they do wear the hijab in a place like Calgary, Alberta, Canada, So I share with them some examples of some success stories that students have done in the past, and I try to raise them up to a higher level, so they can reach, I show them some exemplars of some things that students have done, and I say, you too can do this. The quality of your assignment comes to how well you're willing to do the original legwork, like thinking about what topic do you really need to do. Some students do more than one topic because they find they go to one thing and then it wasn't really resonating with them, or they didn't learn a lot there, and so then I just say, well, go ahead and do another one. We can do this on and on, right? Learning about different groups and trying to have an open mind.
Well, thank you. So there's a lot more in the chat. So also interested to hear how students can connect with organizations to gain permission and ensure respectful conduct on their project.
Oh, that's a great question too. Yeah. So I asked them to Google it. And sometimes, a lot of religious groups I shouldn't say a lot, but some anyways, are very open to newcomers and people learning about their faith, because there is an element of some religious groups about evangelizing, right? Like trying to share the word of God or word of whatever higher power they believe in, and to gain more followers, right? So they're actually quite open to people coming and learning about their faith. And they also know that there can be some discrimination out there circulating because of misinformation. So they're happy to have people come in and learn. There are other groups that are actually quite closed, like, for example, support groups for LGBTQI youth. They don't want just anybody attending those. The people who are there, the adults that are there to work with LGBTQI youth are there because they're in a leadership role with a school usually, or they're a counselor or something of that sort. So they really have to gain permission to be in that group, and they have to explain what they're there for. And then if it's a closed group, then it's a closed group. If they're not welcome, they're not welcome. They can actually learn about that group in different ways. Like you can, like during the pandemic, right? There were a lot of, we're still in a pandemic, but there's still not a lot of in-person opportunities to go to these sessions, but there's a lot of opportunity to do these things online, right? You can go to, there are support groups online or forums where people discuss, and you can learn a lot through that. And if you can't find an online forum, then you can learn by watching videos or movies or something about that group, and just try to learn something new about the group so that you open your mind about it.
Great, thank you. And then along the same lines, how do you create a brave space or psychological safety to start the conversation?
Yeah, that's a hard one. A brave space requires a lot of legwork, if you will, up front at the beginning of the course to set the standards for the class, and something that I call group norms. Like I ask my classmates or students that I'm teaching, okay, how do we want to be together as a class? Like, what are some things that really work for you? And you've been in school for a long time. What are things that work that you would like to see in this class? And then you have to wait a long time as a teacher, have that wait time. And I use, whatever tools are available to me in the classroom to write down what they're saying that they like to see. They like to see discussions, and then there can be like some people who say the exact opposite, like, oh, I don't like whole group discussions. I like small group discussions. Like, okay, make sure we have a mixture of that, right? So we set up the group norms in the class at the beginning to make sure everyone's comfortable in the class. And then I share a lot about myself as well, so that that's how you get people to share with you, if you're willing to share something about yourself. So I tell them about my research and why it's important to me. I tell them about some identity markers that I have as well. And then they start to trust me more, And so that's one of the ways that we establish a brave space. And then also when things go off the rails as the semester wears on and people get tired and deadlines come, we then have to revisit those group norms that I took a record of, right? And I say, oh, okay, remember we talked about how we don't want to talk over other people when they're speaking, or speak angrily about groups. We have to try to maintain our composure when we're in class. We're trying to be professional here. We're trying to learn to be professional teachers. So let's remember that there's a certain amount of composure that we have to have. So I just remind them of some of the things that we have done as a group, right? And so it's not just like the prof overarching like person being like, hey, you people, don't do this and this. We said, I don't want to see that. It's not just me, it's all of us. We're making a class together. And so that's one of the ways to create a brave space.
Great, thank you. Roman Shore has said, I've attempted to add a discussion on biases in the first year of engineering design course, and then apply it to data visualization. This is ENGG 200, the course. Mm-hmm. Feedback from students has indicated that it was their favorite part of the course for some folks. If you have suggestions on where additional content or information about how to present this, I'm always looking to improve.
Okay. Yeah, I think when it's subject specific like that, I think that's one of the things that we all have to be as a lifelong learner, right? And see what are other engineer instructors doing about biases in engineering as a discipline, as a profession, and keep adding to your biases. You can also revisit it, not just only at the beginning of the course, but revisit it maybe middle and towards the end as well. Talk about some of the things that was already mentioned earlier by Dr. Johnson about how sometimes students' assignments are marked more difficultly depending on what their subject position is, or if they come from certain groups that are mistreated and maligned. If that's apparent in the assignment, there are ways to mitigate some of that. Like what we teach in the Werklund school is to take the student's name off the assignment before you start grading it, so that you're not you're just looking at the text. You're just not, you don't know who wrote that one. And so, because, you know, as we hopefully have established a rapport with the class and you get to know people in certain ways, right? And it is very challenging in online teaching, though. I've done a lot of that, and both prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic. It's hard when it's a bunch of black boxes. You don't know who's who, right? You also don't know if that person even wrote that essay, right? Did they go and buy it somewhere, or their friend did it for them? Those kinds of things. So it's best not to have the name associated with it. So if you can find a way to take the names off the essays before you mark them, or whatever it is that you're marking, that's one way to reduce bias there. But yeah, I recommend just adding to what you're already doing. That's an excellent approach already.
Great, thank you. We have another question. What measures do you put in to support students who may be emotionally overwhelmed or triggered in the classroom because of their lived experiences and trauma history?
Well, yeah, that's a really tough one. Of course, I mentioned to the students that all of the wonderful supports that are available at the University of Calgary through our mental health strategy. I also remind them, hey, you know what, you've already paid for this through your student fees. So go and take advantage of the counseling that's available. You have, I think it's 5 sessions that they're allowed to have. So I bring that up at the beginning. I say to them, you know, some of these topics that we're going to be covering are very, very difficult, hard to hear. And especially if you're that group, a member of that group, like if we're talking about transphobia and you're a trans person in class, or homophobia and you're a queer person like myself, teaching about that is not easy. So I tell them about how I feel when that comes up, but I also you know, invite them to stay present, you know, to work through those feelings, and rather than just leave or check out, you know, because if that's what you, sometimes when you give a trigger warning, people say, oh yeah, no, if this is about blah blah, I'm not going to be here for that, and it just really loses an opportunity for learning for when they just remove themselves from the situation. And then I say to them, like, whatever techniques that you have developed as, you know, for resiliency in your life to help you get through when things are difficult, use those, like if it's breathing exercises or journaling or turning your attention elsewhere to your phone. We all know students are on their phone all the time, elsewhere for a moment if they find this topic too overwhelming. But I do ask them to stay present and work through it, because just removing yourself from a difficult conversation is not the way to learn, because we can learn from others, and they can also learn from how I moderate the class discussion. Like if there's somebody saying something that using some us them language, for example, which happens a lot, like students make assumptions about, they think the whole class is white, for example, and usually look around, they think everybody's white. It's like, no, not everybody here is white. Or they think that there's no Indigenous people in the class, and there's no way of knowing if there's an Indigenous person in the class unless they reveal that to us. So you know, I just say to them, you can't say like we're all one. Like there are many forms of diversity in this classroom here. So let's just try to step away from the us them language, and just invite them, like very calmly and just pleasantly, to say, okay, let's think about this in a different way. Or if there's arguments going on, like which can happen, I say, like, let's make space for that viewpoint, and let's make space for this viewpoint. Let's also find evidence to support some of these viewpoints. Are some of these viewpoints worthy of discussion, or some of them more conspiracy theories that are lacking evidence? And if they're lacking evidence, that's what we're supposed to do at the university, is point out that there's no evidence to support that, and just don't belittle the person that made this inflammatory statement. To say, well, you know, there's actually no evidence to support that. Let's Google it. Let them all use their devices to Google and say, okay, so I don't have to know everything, but we can all learn this together. What is accurate, what isn't accurate, right?
So the next question is around socioeconomic disadvantages, such as children of single parents, students in a caregiver capacity for a parent, first in higher education. So how do we advocate for addressing these inequities along with the other equity deserving groups that we are just starting to be more aware of?
Yeah, class is a big one that is often overlooked. And so I try to make sure that there's opportunities in each of my assignments for students to propose something different, to do an alternative assignment. And I also try to let those that have some, you know, talents and that exceptionalities sing, really, and have a platform to show their abilities. So when we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about deficits, but also some people may be really talented artists or really good with technology, right? So if they are, let's say, gifted people in that way, then give them a chance to shine. I mean, some people are very extroverted and have these abilities. So invite them to instead of write an essay, they can they can do a presentation if they wish, and that's much shorter. But they still have to hand in some writings. I have to see that they have tied this to some theories and things, but their writing is much shorter than what the other people are doing who are writing the essay. So I give them I ask them to hand in something that's 5 pages, double spaced, and then they have an opportunity to present and then show us what they learned with their social justice action project. And sometimes these things they move us to tears. Like some people are just amazing, where some people create a song and then they sing the song, and or even interpretive dances I've seen, like if you can believe it. So it really makes the class gel and see like, oh, this student really took this assignment very seriously. Or people who are really good with technology, they want to show us and they make a video. Some of the videos these students make are just astounding. It's just incredible. So give them opportunities to express themselves differently in the class. And if there's a person who's struggling with socioeconomic status, then maybe they might prefer to just present their experience rather than write a lot. And maybe they don't have access to technology, but they would like to just share in a more old school kind of way they're learning. So give opportunities for students to think of different ways to do the assignment, but also make yourself approachable so that they feel that they can come to you and say, Dr. Callaghan, I'd like to do this. Would that be okay? And then say yes, like, yes, it's okay. Let's do something different, right?
Great, thank you. And then in regards to the recommendations, I think you had this on your final slides. What was the last point on the second to last slide? If you could highlight that,
Let me find that,
please. And just a note to the participants that this session is being recorded, so you can access it again. And there is also a request for your slides.
Sure, we can share these slides. I've given them to the organizers. So, so the second last point was provide funding to cross-disciplinary groups, especially for women of color, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit groups, to widen their networks of support. Respond rapidly and unequivocally to remove racial injustice, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, and other forms of exclusion. Like, don't sit on it. When students or somebody brings it to you and says, this is what's going on over here, don't just be like, la-di-da, like, I find out something to do about this, like solve this problem and take it to the people of the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, or EDI. And so also provide funding for marginalized groups, especially those that I mentioned, cross-disciplinary groups, women of color, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit groups, because we know that when those people are given funding, they can create incredible things. So provide that funding overtly, like make it known, make it available.
Thank you. Do students choose from several options for the evaluative component? I guess you did mention that in terms of having diversity. And so any other thoughts around that?
Oh, yes, they choose so many things. Sometimes I have to tamper it, like I have to say, this is just a course. I don't want you putting yourself in any kind of harm's way. Like some people have said that they really want to experience what it's like to be unhoused. And so they want to go and live rough in the park or whatever. And it's okay, yeah, that's a bit too much. Like, that's putting yourself at risk, and let's not do that, right? There are other ways you can experience what it might be like to be homeless without yourself having to put yourself in that circumstance. Also, there's some groups that people would like to learn more about that are extremely dangerous and frightening, like white supremacy groups, right? So if there are people who are trying to understand the mindset of a white supremacist, you don't have to go and befriend a white supremacist or go to their march or whatever. Like there are other more tame ways to do that if you really want to get inside the mind of somebody who is a white supremacist to better understand them. And then there are some people who take it very personally, like they say things like, oh, I was raised in the Church of Scientology, and then I left my family, and I would like to learn more about that faith. I want to reconnect with my father, and all these things. And it's just like, well, you would want to do that with the support of a therapist. Like that is beyond the scope of this assignment. Like, let's try to do things that are manageable, right, and acceptable within the time frame that we have. And I ask them not to put themselves too far out there, right? So don't take too much of a risk, but take a risk so that you're actually learning something,
Thank you so much. I don't see any more comments on the chat. Oh, actually, Dr. Callaghan, I just want to recognize and thank you for bringing such a compassionate, curious, and intentional ethics of care to this session and to your educational practice.
Well,
it is
thank you.
so easy to become hardened and to shut down certain viewpoints under the guise of accountability or safety. But your way of doing, in fact, seems to facilitate both of these. And this is from Jaya Dixit.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that feedback.
Wonderful session. I wonder, are there any other questions or comments?
I don't mind speaking up. I was just typing.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm Jocelyn. Hi.
Hi.
My pronouns are she, her. Thank you for talking about the different evaluative methods. I thought that was very useful. And I really appreciated your point on making space for people with lived experiences. I teach nursing students south of the river at Mount Royal. And so often we invite families, patients to particular classrooms and courses. And I think it's a great example of where, while we might provide a gift, it may not be payment. Do you know what I mean? That recognition, and you talked about finding funding and funding streams. And I really think if you found any, I would love to know, because I find this with arts and the artists as well. I bring in arts and humanities into focus, but paying people for their work can be very challenging when we want them either in the classroom or virtually. So I think we have to get better at that, I guess, right? It is not just welcoming in those voices, but paying people for their work and really telling them their work matters.
Yes, and that payment part is really difficult. Some institutions do have funding available for guest speakers and others do not. And so there are other ways to pay people back. For example, if you're inviting someone to come into your class as a guest speaker, one of the things that many of us in the academy can do is we sure know how to write, right? So we can help them with their applications for if they're going to apply to grad school, if they have a child that's applying to university, or if they need a letter of recommendation for something, we can give them those kinds of things, or read their work and give them feedback. Give them other opportunities if they really don't need payment, but they do need a platform to share their ideas, and say to them, well, we're always welcome to have you back. Give them credit for their work on the slides, or wherever if you're publishing anything, invite them to publish, co-author with you. Make sure they are acknowledged in the acknowledgements for the piece. So there are other ways to thank people, and you can also talk to them about what would be an acceptable form of thanks. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for attending today. It's so great to see people from Mount Royal University.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Good.
Any other thoughts or comments? So I have a couple. Thank you again, Dr. Callaghan, for this wonderful presentation. You mentioned the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and the first thing that came to mind was learning about political ideologies. And you did mention living in Alberta, that can also kind of come into play. And so how would you navigate that? I guess, the broader arena being very much conservative.
That's so challenging. What a great question. We have to just overtly address it in the classroom, because people like me in the United States right now, the kind of work that I do, critical social justice education, we're being called all kinds of awful names, like especially related to LGBTQ. I'm being called a groomer, not me personally, but people who do this work. A groomer, which we all know is somebody who is grooming a child for sexual assault or sexual interference. So there's all kinds of names that we are given that are just unacceptable. And so we have to overtly address that. And we're also called things like bleeding heart socialists, right? And so a lot of people don't even know what a socialist is, right? So then we have to, in my classes, we talk about Karl Marx. Who is that person? What are some of his thoughts? What is Marxism? What is socialism? What is communism? What are these things? So we're using the right terms, right? And then so when people call me a socialist, I say to them, like, that's actually not an insult. Many of our programs in Canada, including our public health system, is a socialist concept. So I remind them of that, so that you're benefiting from socialist ideas, right? So We just have to overtly address it and use every tool in the toolbox that we've got to combat misinformation and misunderstanding out there, while being compassionate for people who just, for no fault of their own, they may just, that may be what they learned at home or what the parents say at home, and they just don't know how to evaluate information online properly, right? So they're going down that rabbit hole that we're all capable of doing in social media settings, where we're basically talking to our own echo chamber, right? So we have to get them out of there, and that's one of the reasons that we do this assignment, the Action for Social Justice, is to have people interact with different groups, so that they're not only talking to those that say the same thing over and over again or have the same worldviews. We need to interact with others who see things differently and actively listen to them, right? And rather than arguing over them and trying to get them to see your way of seeing the world, learn how others see the world. And that's one of the things I tell them with that assignment too, is I say, sometimes when we're in confined spaces, like for example, maybe not so much these days in the pandemic, but let's say you're taking a bus somewhere or a train, and you're seated next to somebody that you would not normally be seated next to. You would not normally interact with them. Somebody who's quite different from you. It could be because they're clutching a Bible, or maybe they're wearing the hijab or something. And just like, rather than ignoring them or turning on your devices and watching your screen, start to engage in a conversation with that person, right? Like, and authentically listen to them and show them that you're really listening and you really care. And don't ask them too many difficult questions at the beginning. Like, just initiate a conversation so that you can try to see how others might see the world. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
I think that's it for me.
Okay.
For other questions or comments, but thank you again. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that we hear from you again.
Oh, I would love to come again, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.